And we're back again with the Joint IT Oversight Committee. We're here to welcome for the legislative IT update, Kevin Moore, the Director of Information Technology, the Office of Legislative Information Technology. Kevin, we're going to talk again as the third branch regarding the whole issue of the IT infrastructure, the systems and risk ranking and so on. And again, if we do get into a part in which we'll be talking about information security issues, resiliency issues, and so on, we will go into executive session for that part and then come back live.
Sounds good, Senator.
The floor is yours.
All right. So thank you, Senator. Thank you, committee, for having me back. For the record, Kevin Moore, Director of IT for the legislature. Please feel free to stop me at any point, interrupt me, ask questions. This first section is pretty similar to what you've seen. I believe it was end of September 30th is when I first provided this presentation. I've since updated it, and there's still room for improvement. I'm happy to address those points as we go through. All right, jump right into it here. So updated results of a risk-based software inventory. One of the things that we have yet to collaborate on is the definition of application. So we take a pretty comprehensive approach to it at this point in time, and would rather weed things out than not include something that we're unaware of. So we follow the same methodology used by ADS, established by ADS in the early stages of this. This is a recycled slide from that particular point in time. Just going to skip through quickly. This is the scoring criteria. Again, this is a recycled slide, but just for information purposes. So here's the updated analysis as far as total data points. You've taken just shy of 17,000 data points into consideration at this point in our process. I would still stress that we're early on in our process to make sure we have a very clear grasp of everything and the cyber risk associated with it. At some point, we will have to develop a consistent and repeatable model on how we want to present business risk analysis to this committee. We understand what applications have a higher business risk impact as opposed to cybersecurity risk impact, and we can certainly discuss those. But for the consistency among branches, we certainly should standardize at some point on how we present to this committee. We have about 181 unique pieces of software at this point in time. We've improved from 217 previously. Our last presentation, we have 328 versions of those applications out and about. We still haven't replaced any software terms. We've ignored about 3,300 terms that fall into this data set, primarily different drivers, different things that are being upgraded. It really isn't relevant to this information. But we wanted to make sure we highlighted that. Jumped into the wrong slide here. This is where we were in September. This is our initial analysis about risk by category, 1 being the lowest risk, 10 being the highest risk, or excuse me, 12 being the highest risk using this point factor analysis. And you'll see we had several 7+ scores, but we were largely around 6. As we move forward, as of yesterday, we've improved quite significantly since our last analysis. Some of this is largely due to operating system improvements. We've gone through over 75% of our server infrastructure so far to upgrade to current revisions, make sure that we're in a long-term extended support position. And that's really where a lot of our higher numbers were coming from previously. The same could be said about our workstation, laptop, desktop environment. We've continued to improve that. We're still in process. And you'll see these numbers continue to go down because those were some of our highest risk categories. We were never out of
Just ask a question quickly. When you talk about laptop and so on, are you talking about those that are owned by the legislature, or are you talking about, in many cases, those that are used by legislators to connect into the network?
So we do not take into consideration in this analysis bring your own device fleets. That is an area of improvement that we've talked about previously, and I will talk about a little bit more as far as current status of where we are as a IT shop and future projects that we want to take into consideration. This does take into account our iPad fleet. Just again, at a high level, this exercise does very much continue to provide a good deal of data to us. It is solidifying what we had as a baseline understanding. A little bit of information on version control of some applications throughout our environment to make sure that we have a consistent distribution of the same version of application that helps with support purposes and obviously helps from a cybersecurity perspective too. We do have a patch management system, but think of it kind of like a MinnoNet. It works 99.9% of the time, but every now and again, if a device is offline, we're at home and remote networks, something's turned off, it may miss that patch cycle until it comes back onto the network via VPN. So MinnoNet is kind of the analogy I use to capture most things, but every now and again, something slips through. This process has really helped us identify what those are in addition to the processes we had in place beforehand. The riskiest applications very much continue to be well known to us. It's more of a business risk with about 1 or 2 exceptions. I'm happy to discuss those as you suggested, Senator, in executive session. And then scoring improvements. We've gone through and helped to validate our data, continue to improve that data set that we're using to provide this analysis to you. And that's really where the bulk of this information has come from and provided us for insight. We continue to want to complete our data set. We still see it as incomplete. It will be a forever ongoing process. It's not something that's going to go away, but we want to make sure we establish a more automated routine. We're slowly improving there, but to be able to collect up-to-date information at a point in time with very little staff interaction is what we're trying to achieve. And then we want to turn around and use that data to make informed decisions, both for cybersecurity purposes, but also for budget development purposes to make sure that we're putting our dollars in the right direction to improve these systems and moving the most critical systems to the top of the pile for action before we address something that perhaps doesn't have the same level of risk.
Sure. Could I just understand the going back a few slides, your unique pieces of software
Right.
down, 40 odd. Does that correspond to your dramatic progress on?
It does. It very much does. So the unique pieces of software, I'm trying to recall, I'd have to actually call a friend, if you will, to double check if it's the unique pieces of software we're charting or the unique software versions. I believe it's the prior, the unique pieces of software that we are charting.
Oh, their unique software versions is right.
Oh, hang on, did I? I might be wrong here.
You've got both data points in that list as well.
I have both data points in the list. As far as the analysis charts, I believe we are graphing. We're going the wrong direction here.
Well, I'm not so concerned about the graph. I guess that seems like I'm surprised that we have 181 pieces of software. And I'm curious if you have a ballpark of like, what would be your grade? Is it 18? Is it 80? Or are we, you know what I mean?
So I think it really comes down to, Senator, I want to make sure I answer your questions, keep me on track here. I think it comes down to what I mentioned when I started a moment ago, is really that definition of application. Are we looking at programs as a operational definition of this is a program and these are the pieces of software that support that program? Or are we looking at applications installed on the network, more or less? We're taking the approach of applications as a software definition, applications on the network. So that's everything that's installed from Microsoft Office all the way through the various applications that other offices will need in order to complete their work. It's probably a more granular approach to this than what we ultimately want. But again, we wanted to err on the side of too much information rather than not enough. Now, for programs, let's say our legislative management system. So how do we track bills? How do we track legislation as it evolves from a bill request all the way, or a drafting request, all the way up through final passage? That takes into account multiple applications at a software level, but I would consider that one program from an operational perspective. And so that's kind of the definition difference I think we need to slowly work out as far as what this committee wants to understand. Because we can get quite granular, which is where we start, or we can keep it higher level and talk about those programs. Did that answer your question, Senator?
I think so. And do you have a target? You know, should it be half of this? Just less or what?
It's always less. So we want to make sure that we have consistent versions. We keep a mentality of keep it simple. So the fewer applications, the safer the environment. It's less to keep eyes on. It's less to worry about as far as cybersecurity perspective goes. It's less to support. So as far as individual unique pieces of software on the network, I'd love to see it cut in half. Without hesitation, I'd love to see that cut in half.
There's a substantial number of the key systems that we have, such as the system tracking a bill from drafting to enactment. Are those typically proprietary systems as opposed to things that were built from off the shelf, in effect off the shelf?
So in regards to the legislative management system, that is very much a custom piece of software. It's not what we would call commercial off the shelf or COTS for sure. There are other vendors in the space which claim to be more of a commercial off the shelf product, but it's such a nuanced business model, if you will, a need in the industry as a whole. There's only 49 other legislatures in the country. You know, large city governments are going to want something of this nature, but certainly not select boards, as opposed to, say, the banking industry, where you have plenty of demand for a product, and you can start standardizing those products a little more to be able to purchase commercial off the shelf. Our goal, anytime we're selecting applications to serve a need in the General Assembly, is to select commercial off the shelf products first, even if they don't meet 100% of our requirements. We'll stop and look at those requirements to make sure that they're truly needed, as opposed to maybe we could change a workflow to adapt to the product. If that doesn't work, then we move over to the custom side, or we look at a supplemental system. But really try to stay with commercial off-the-shelf products for the support, the stability of the product, and being able, again, to troubleshoot it consistently.
Do you look at what other states are doing to find the very best state legislative management system there is in the world, and then compare how we're doing relative to it?
Yes, routinely, actually. So we're a member of the National Conference of State Legislatures subgroup, National Association of Legislative Information Technology. We routinely discuss these types of issues with other state legislatures. If we were still going to national conferences, which has happened due to the pandemic for a couple of years now, we would take time to meet those vendors in that space. I can count them on one hand. The vendors in that space. And there are the Honda Civic versions for a poor analogy, and then there's the Mercedes-Benz versions. There's not really a Chevy or a Ford in between. It's little money, higher customization, more support, or big dollars, 7-figure installs, and then 10-ish% of that original figure annually for support and maintenance of that product. We're on the Honda Civic side. Just to be every now and again, we could probably spend a little bit more money on that product, get a little bit better support. There's a huge difference, a huge cost delta between the products. We've explored it routinely. We get a great value for how much we spend, but there is certainly room for improvement.
Is there anything on the horizon, or anything that you think ought to be on the horizon, in terms of significant system improvements that we should be looking at?
Yes.
It looks like you're prepared for.
I was. So at one point, Senator, when we were planning for this meeting, you had asked about some items that we are currently working on as well. Do you want me to go through those first, or just double back? All right. So in end of July, I believe I appeared before the committee as well, about July 23rd, if my notes are correct here. And I gave a roughly next 6 months and the next 12+ month time frame. So just some updates on that is really where we'll go. So the last 6 months now, we've been supporting the Legislative Apportionment Board reapportionment process. Once a decade process, bringing in some custom GIS software in order to go through and reapportion the entire state, both Senate and House. Now, we don't have an obligation, statutory obligation, to support the Legislative Apportionment Board. The Secretary of State's office does. However, custom and tradition otherwise says that we share that platform with them. It also helps us operationally speaking later on down the line to ingest that product and then manipulate it through our committee processes. So we've been supporting them quite heavily to make sure that they can get through. They've been on a quite shorter time frame because the census data was released late. But that's one of the big projects we've been working on over the last 6 months. We're starting to transition to the legislative side of it. We've been supporting judicial retention. So every year we have a collection of data that has to go out, a lot of surveys, a lot of information to aggregate and then distribute that as well. We've expanded our security tools over the last 6 months to help us better identify cyber threats in our more distributed footprint. It's worked well. We've had a couple of use cases for it already, and it allows us just that little bit more insight into responding to issues. As I mentioned, we've had a significant push over the last 6 months to update our baseline server operating systems, and we've successfully replaced about 75% of those over the last 6 months. Same thing for desktop operating systems. I don't have a percentage for you on that one. I think it's less than, I think we're about 50% on that fleet so far. We did successfully hire a web developer, so it was an open position. Brought on a web developer about 3 weeks ago, already hitting the ground running, which is fantastic. Allows us to be a little bit more nimble in both future development, but really maintenance support and feature requests or enhancements of our existing sites and services. Then we have, oh goodness, we are introducing in the process of the video conferencing committee process.
Sure.
So huge project. We fall apart every single committee room at this point. And we're starting to integrate the hardware over the next 2 weeks. The hardware should start integrating into those committee rooms, and then we'll start the configuration and layout of cabling and so on and so forth to make those rooms successful, both audio, visual, presentation purposes. So that's the project. Nope.
May I jump in? Sure. So the House committees have been somewhat set up that way already. Has it been useful or do you have to restart there?
No, so we're essentially ripping, so little history on the House committee rooms. We had looked at high resolution monitors about 10 years ago, Fortunate being the driving force behind it, believe it or not. And the rooms that we found needed the higher resolution, we were able to find the money for those rooms. But we didn't have enough in our budget to do monitors in every space. We did a projector and a whiteboard setup, which has been great. It worked really well. But it's not sufficient at this point to meet the video conference need. So we have pulled those projectors and whiteboards. We're now installing high definition screens as you see behind me, mounting those to the wall, full motion mounts, making sure that we have high quality 4K cameras in all spaces so you can see everybody around the table. We're installing 360-degree cameras and supplemental, really backup cameras in that space in case we have an issue. We're installing high fidelity microphones and installing high fidelity speaker systems as well. All of it routes back to, I'm not sure if Mike can show the tablet, roughly a single 8-inch, 9-inch diagonal touch panel, regardless of which space you're in. So you have a consistent setup in all rooms, regardless of scope, size, committee, Senate, House. It allows committee assistants to move from space to space and intuitively start a meeting and not have a IT burden when they're just trying to get a meeting off the ground and keep up with their committee assistant duties. So long answer, they worked for a good 8-10 years really well. They just don't meet the need now. So we have taken those out and we're putting new systems in.
One of the things that I've noticed about committee meetings that appear on the screen. So when the public is looking at committee meeting, they see these masses of pencil-sized people who appear on the screen, and you can't see facial expressions. You can, in many cases, see who's talking. They're so far distant that creates, in effect, a lack of visualization. I did notice, for example, when we had the special session, for example, that those of us who are in the chamber, who also set up a Zoom screen, were able to, when they were speaking, appeared on Zoom so the public could actually see who was talking and see what they said. And it seemed to work very well in the chamber. because again, the sound is off on the laptop and so on. Is that also feasible in the committee rooms?
It is. I see it as a potential issue as far as help desk goes. If one individual leaves a speaker on or a microphone on accidentally or toggles it, it can create a sound loop. The committee assistant may not be able to troubleshoot in real time.
Give the committee assistant a
But we certainly anticipate a need or a desire of some legislators to have that more intimate, if you will, view on Zoom. However, I think you'll all be pleasantly surprised by the time you get around your committee tables, because the camera will no longer be in the back of the room with a wide angle shot. It will instead be in the center of your table with a 360 shot, and you should be able to see pretty well midsection up of every legislator at all times.
And it will automatically focus on who's talking, right?
It will show everybody at all times. It does not have to transition to who's talking.
Really, for the person at home, it's gonna zoom in and give them a priority, no?
No,
They will
so
see
we'll-
everybody
You'll
at all.
see everybody. I'm happy to give you a demonstration later on,
I look
Senator.
forward to it.
But it's actually, it's quite impressive. Mike might be able to chime in. He's been one of our testers at some point. But the chair of the committee will be top dead center of the screen in a pane that covers the front half of the table. And on the bottom pane, you'll have the witness dead center of that. And then the bottom half of the table, the lower half of the table, viewable at all times. So it's a pretty nice setup. We're fortunate to come across it. Chambers are still a challenge. I will say that in the House chamber specifically, it's just not practical in our time frame to get up close and personal with anybody who's talking at any given point.
Well, that's why the Zoom or the device on the desk does enable you to see who's talking directly at any point in time without interfering with anything
It's
else.
certainly an option. I mean, it's precisely what I'm doing right now. I just happen to have muted all of my inputs just so I could share the screen.
Anything further from you?
I have a handful of pieces, and then I'll get into some bigger
Good.
future parts, if you don't mind. So we're working through committee rooms, we're working through chambers as well, same overall goal, providing a live stream capability, but in some cases, those rooms are going to be used, I think, policy dependent for caucuses as well. And so for example, the House Democratic Caucus is a quorum of the entire body, typically want to live stream that. Same thing for the Senate, not always the case. I'll stay out of the policy side of it, but we want to make sure we have that capability to live stream or even video conference in those spaces, should that need be there. Have plenty of supply chain issues with our manufacturers at this point. Just like everybody else, we're about 2,000 products behind. Other customers are in front of us right now. So we're working on contingency plans, and our staff is staying quite nimble to make sure that we have the necessary tools available still, even if they're not in their final form by the time we hit the beginning of session. For example, sessions was live streamed, and that's not the vendor provided equipment. That is internal legislative IT setting that up. And the briefing next week will be a bi-directional conference as well. So that'll allow us to have people sit in Zoom land or be in the room. We talked about previously in July our approach to enterprise password management.
Mike, who was that just came in and brought that in here?
That was one of our committee assistants. That's the
Okay, great.
committee assistant box that has the nameplates.
Thank
and
you.
other materials.
Thank you.
Borrowed it.
Mike. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Stop the share.
It's literally called Mike's meeting in a box.
So the password management solution we talked about, this is an enterprise password management. It's to make sure people aren't writing things down on sticky notes, put them on their keyboards, not reusing passwords. It's a workflow improvement for them. We're progressing through the final stages of testing and integration. And we have created the training, and we're going to start looking to roll that out to offices selectively over the next couple of months. Rollout, just as a note, is entirely dependent on the workflow of that office and the capacity of that office. So if they're overloaded, we're not going to force it upon them. We'll wait until they're ready. Continued development of our in-house training, that's still improving. We have our classroom space over at 133 almost fully stood up. We've already trained small groups in there, and we're actually training all of our committee assistants, our new incoming committee assistants in that. So that's a improvement from where we were. And the last piece I talked about within that 6-month time frame in July was the voice over IP phone solution. The contract was what was holding us back. It has since been executed. We have since engaged with the vendor. We've done an internal site survey, understanding where we want to go. And the vendor is soon to come down and do a supplemental site survey to make sure all of our information meshes before we start rolling forward with that project as well. But very much on track. Over the next 12 months, we are, let me just make sure I read my notes properly here. Obviously, it's tidying up and facilitating the legislative process throughout the committee room, video conference integration and live stream integration. But then we really get to the next piece, which is consider and discuss the replacement of legislator iPads with a fully featured laptop. This has not always been desirable, primarily from a cost perspective. An iPad's pretty inexpensive. It's easy to manage. It doesn't take much for us to do. But if there's one thing the pandemic really exposed is that it's not keeping up with what the legislator needs are if the legislator is remote. It's close, but not quite there, as all of you are, almost all of you are bringing a supplemental device today. So 10 years ago, when we introduced iPads, 8 years ago, when we introduced iPads, it was a huge improvement. The prior to that, people were walking around with big stacks of paper, some with shoestrings holding them together. With a great content delivery device, it now needs to be more than what it was originally intended to be. But that's a big discussion. It's a whether or not we want to have that many more devices in our fleet, make sure we manage them, pay for them, maintain them. That's a big discussion. We want to retire our archival website and integrate that data set into our current public facing website. There's a lot of history there. I'll keep it high level. 2009 and forward is available on our primary website. If you want to research anything older than 2009, you have to go to what we call our archival site. We don't want to support that anymore for a variety of reasons. It's a bear to support. We can get into details in executive session if you'd like, but we want to get that moving on at some point. Hope to do that within the next 12 plus months with our in-house web development.
Does that mean, in other words, that the archival materials would be available to any of us on whatever device we're using without having to go into a separate system?
Correct. It would be on the primary site, one-stop shop for all data. The data set is different. We didn't always collect the same amount of data points as we do now. So it'll appear to be incomplete in comparison to the data set that we have currently, but it'll be every piece of information we have would be available on the primary website. New data center was another issue. We're currently working with BGS, Department of Buildings and General Services, to renovate space within the Capitol complex to stand up our new data center. We're cautiously optimistic to have access to that within the next calendar year.
I think there were some concerns regarding some of the places in which we house data today about potential for flooding and
Yes.
so on. Do you have an estimated timeline as to when that will be resolved?
So if this data center is stood up within the next calendar year, we would look to move our primary operations to that immediately following. And that would probably be a 6 to 8 week process back and upload. We have new office buildings, 2 acre and 4 acre were recently acquired. So we're working with BGS, Sergeant at Arms, other contractors to get those stood up, fit up with new data lines, new electrical for one of those buildings, and making sure that we have what is necessary in that space for legislative staff to be successful. But those are new office buildings. We want to begin writing up a pandemic response plan. When the pandemic hit, there was one legislature, to my knowledge, that had a written pandemic response plan. That was Kansas.
Wow.
So we were certainly not alone by not having that. I can tell you that their pandemic response plan didn't do very well because it was dated, and they essentially set it aside in the round file, and it had to respond much like every other state did, which is pretty well off the cuff. But seeing how we have this fresh rather intimate knowledge of how to respond to a pandemic, we would like to write that down, formalize it, and keep that in our toolbox for future use. Mentioned start planning the next generation website. Our current generation website was launched in 2015. Standards and practices have changed and evolved since then. We have additional need for integration video now, as opposed to not having that need or desire previously. And so we want to continue that planning process or start that planning process for the next generation website within the next 12 months. Bring in the stakeholder groups that we're familiar with and really start working towards that next generation site very purposefully. Other projects that we're looking at is a legislator dashboard. So all these diffused systems that are out there, all these different pieces and parts that you as a legislator have to think about in order to communicate with your constituents, with your attorneys, with chambers, with other legislators. I don't like the term because it's overused in the industry, but I'd like to see all of that information in a single pane of glass. It's essentially having one spot that's always accessible to each legislator where you can manipulate, think tiles, you can manipulate which pieces of information you want on the screen at any given point, securely communicate with your attorney without having to open other applications, securely communicate with the other legislators, think seeking co-sponsors of a bill, securely sign digitally, perhaps, in that same application, as opposed to having to get that handwritten wet signature on a piece of paper for co-sponsors. Bringing all of those tools and pieces apart into one secure web portal for each legislator is really a project that we've been dreaming of for a good long while now. We saw something similar in the state of Tennessee, 2018, I want to say. And it was a huge advantage for their chambers. So an individual legislator could subscribe to a bill that they have a keen interest on, and then turn around and get automatic updates fed to them as that's changing in the legislative management system. The other piece that was really intriguing was when a legislator is sitting on the floor, perhaps they're multitasking, not policy specific there, but perhaps they're multitasking. The top of the screen was always what the current action of that chamber was. So you could click on it, bring you to the right page of the calendar, bring you to the right bill in discussion, instantly have that feedback from that chamber. So there's a lot of pieces and parts that come into this, a lot of dependent systems that would come into this, but that's a pretty big dream of ours just to start planning within the next 12 months. I can keep going. I have a handful of pieces, but I think I'm probably getting a little detailed at this point, so I'd ask for questions. If you want me to keep going, I'm happy to do so.
And just a suggestion as you try to think about our technological future, what would help me would be a simple way to send the same response to multiple emails.
Constituent
Right?
services
So,
is something we are actively looking at for that same platform.
and it's got to be in there if you're trying to improve our life. And it must be possible, but
It is.
you know, if constituents are going to send us hundreds of identical messages, then I think it's more than appropriate that we would have the chance to
Send out the
pretty
same.
easily say, here's the answer.
Yes.
From my point of view.
So that is something, actually, we had a vendor proactively come in recently to talk to us. They're still very much in the startup phase, so we're a little gun shy with this particular vendor, but there are improvements in this space well beyond taking a commercial off the shelf customer management platform, which is not the same as a constituent management platform. So they're really building in that space, and I see the industry starting to really rally around that. I will certainly keep that in mind for the legislative dashboard going forward.
The comment I would make is if you are truly considering moving from a legislator having an iPad an iPad as opposed to a laptop, there will necessarily be a tremendous amount of training involved, I would
Yes.
think, to the individual.
Absolutely.
And that has to be counted as part of your.
It most certainly does, and that is one of the primary reasons we brought on a dedicated training support person 2 years ago, was to build this training program, which we've never previously had.
Mhm.
The pandemic slowed us up a little bit on that. But we're starting to really build that out. And we would certainly have training as a part of that rollout program if we went to.
Now, even with the currently iPads, there are tons of folks who do not even use them properly and know how to use them.
I hope to begin offering trainings for legislators on the applications that we provide on the iPads within the next couple of months.
That would be good, I think, for many.
Representative Smith?
Yeah, just really tremendous, Kevin, the work that you all are doing. Thank you again. I know, and really excited to hear about the things in the, looking forward. I do have a few questions, Mr. Chair. Well, no, I mean, if we're able to go
When we go
into session.
Or well, public.
I just want to ditto what Senator Pearson said. I'd love to see that. And I think I know who you're speaking with, and I've had a few conversations with them as well. As for the BYOD policy, bring your own device. I love the notion of not giving me, I never use that iPad. I have like 5 devices and so I would encourage you to explore alternative paths where you can create sort of an accounting expenditure fund. So you either choose to take the iPad, organizations are doing this in the private sector, you take the institutionally assigned device and then you support that, or Senator Chittenden could opt to just support themselves with a BYOD device, and maybe I get a much smaller amount that I can expend on whatever software services or components that I need. And similar to that, I think you mentioned this, but you were looking for ideas to look at. I come from UVM, so I'm always going to make UVM references. One thing that UVM does do that I don't see at the State House that I think might make sense would be a net registration process for Wi-Fi devices, so that when the legislator connects to a ledge Wi-Fi account, you could do a security check, you can actually run through, you can actually associate that device to the legislator. I don't think that's being done now. Like this is the.
So we can get a little more details in executive session.
Sure.
But we have tried that methodology in the past, varying success, depending on the legislator device is really the challenge there. We do use certificate-based authentication for internal devices.
To build off that, the single pane of glass idea could be platform agnostic, which could potentially remove the need of having iPads or laptops issued by the legislature, right?
Precisely. So we primarily developed for a browser at this point. I am personally not a fan of desktop-based applications. It creates additional dependencies. I like to have the ability to be nimble and use any device at any given point and access it from any location.
And would that be like a remote desktop?
I think it would be an authentic browser application. We would have to really flesh this out a little further. But think about it just like a web page where you can log in, much like a bank account, where you can go through and you can manipulate. Some banks already have this type of functionality where you can manipulate what pieces and parts, which accounts you want to see, and securely communicate within that portal.
Well, many of the things that you're talking about today, I gather, though, really are aspirational. There are some, though, that are in development and in planning and in the process of being implemented. Right now, the approval for going ahead with those things that are aspirational, is that the Legislative Management Committee's responsibility?
So it's the legislative management's responsibility to approve the budget. As part of the budget, obviously, we base our projects, which would have an additional cost above and beyond staff time as part of that budget. And so effectively, yes, all of those projects would have to go through the Legislative Management Committee, staff, the JLMC, Joint Legislative Management Committee, excuse me. And then subsequently, it still goes through the appropriation process.
So of the things that you outlined here, where are they relative to this process? What's been approved and what hasn't, I guess is really what I'm asking.
So we're a couple of years into what we were doing for a strategic plan earlier than anticipated. So we've rewritten our strategic plan about 3 times before getting it approved over the last couple of years because of the rapid advances of audio video within the building. So we just had to take on the project rather than take the traditional project approach that we've had years prior. So most of what we're taking on right now is a couple of years into the future. We're going to refine that. We still have a platform decision to make as far as where do we stream. Currently, we're on YouTube. That's not my favorite place to be. It's an effective tool, and it met the need for our time frame. We're currently using Zoom as a video conference platform. It's an effective tool. It's very much met our need. But is it the right one? Do we want to do something different? I believe I mentioned in joint rules a couple days ago that this is a very big conversation to have. Where do we want to be? What do we want integrated? Are we live streaming? Are we video conferencing? What platforms? Is it a public-private partnership? Is it something we maintain in-house? Is it completely offloaded to a outside third-party entity for streaming? There are many policy level questions I think that we have to address before we can narrow that conversation down.
We, at this
Just a
point,
quick comment. In terms of the transition away from iPads potentially, by my observation, the weakness of the iPad has only been because of some people are zooming on it and wanting to access documents. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I remember when I was one of 10 people in the house floor with a laptop and stood out badly. I don't think if it's failed other than if we're remote. And so I don't know how we deal with that and how you look ahead into the future, but just an observation that it's not inherently, I don't think our need is automatically outpaced the iPad other than if we're trying to do remotely online in a virtual setting.
Fair enough. But it's, again, the iPads have been an incredibly effective tool for us for 8-10 years now.
let us, at this point, entertain a motion to move into executive session to discuss security and related issues in legislative IT. Is there a motion to do that?
So moved.
Okay, all those in favor? Okay, we're going then